In addition to the excellent work he's done as the director of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, which is one of the most effective think tanks, in Washington, and has achieved things like promoting national missile defense for the United States. And now that he's heading up the Secure the Grid Coalition, to try to organize all of those people who are interested in trying to protect the electric grid. He had served in the Reagan administration. I think that's actually his most important credentials. When he was actually protecting the country, from a nuclear war, when he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategic Forces Policy. And that's the big brain in the Pentagon that basically thinks, how do we deter the Russian? That man was there at the height of the Cold War when we were most at risk of being attacked by the Russians, and he's one of the people that prevented the Cold War from becoming a thermonuclear conflict. And he was also nominated to be the Deputy Secretary of State for International Security Policy, which is an even more laudatory kind of a position. So, Frank? Thank you.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. I actually learned most of what I know about this subject from Peter, so I'm really going to slipstream on what he has been telling you and maybe show you in some imagery some of the things that he touched on but moved through rather quickly, and then try to draw in some of the specific things that we think need to be done at this point. So let's see if we can make this puppy work. Are we good to go?
Take a second to sync up.
We gotta do that again. Peter was exceedingly generous about my background. It was really the highlight of my career to have spent time in the Pentagon, and the highlight of what I think has historically proven to be an incredibly important time in the nation's history. It's all been downhill from there, frankly, but I'm just trying to help in a small way with this particular problem, which, as best I can tell, is for the reasons that Peter has mentioned, of such paramount concern that it justifies the time that you all are spending on it, and I hope going forward from here we'll be doing even more to help us fix this problem. As is my want, I've described my IT karma is not good. So we had this worked out a short while ago, and it seems not to be operating at the moment. Okay, here we go. Are you familiar with this gal? Our thesis is that if we do not protect the grid, we are going to wind up with a world without America. And I'll talk about that term in a moment. This is a country that you all are familiar with. We are, I believe, facing a very serious threat from it, even before it gets a nuclear weapon, for reasons that have to do with this agenda. This is not simply a slogan. It is part of what they have been actually cultivating within their population and in terms of their capabilities. But this is the term that I wanted to call to your particular attention. This fellow is, of course, no longer the president of Iran, but even when he was the president of Iran, he wasn't really running the place. And this was not simply his agenda, it is the agenda of the regime that he formerly fronted. He said it's not only desirable, but achievable to bring about a world without America. I've often wondered, what was he talking about? Could it be that they would simply be trying to bring it about by the kinds of terrorism they've engaged in, the kind of cyber warfare they've engaged in, the kind of perhaps nuclear attack that the president has said he's particularly concerned about? Well, I think all of those would be bad things, make no mistake about it. But it's not likely that it would be a world without America. So let's cut to what Peter was talking about. How do you achieve this in a way that is practical, highly cost-effective, near-term, and possibly leaves no fingerprints? which is not a minimal consideration, perhaps. Peter showed you a version of this. At 30 miles, you cover roughly that area, 120 miles altitude, that, and 300 miles if you detonate a nuclear weapon over the United States. Raining down on it, as Peter has very well described, immense amounts of electromagnetic energy, which, if you haven't protected electronic and electric gear against it, is potentially devastating, certainly damaging. Now, they're half a world away. How would a country like Iran, which is not supposed to have long-range ballistic missiles, at least not yet, capable of reaching this country, do such an attack against the United States? Well, this is the scenario that Peter's commission worried most about. They call the Scud on a tub scenario. This is an artist rendering of what you could do with a container to put one of these sorts of launchers inside it. The Russians have for sale right now containers that have cruise missiles in them. It's entirely possible that they could have containers that have these ballistic missiles. There are thousands of these around the world right now. Some of them, by the way, are in the hands of not nations, but terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, proxy for the Iranian regime. Well, could that actually be a scenario available to the Iranians? They've, in fact, launched missiles from the sea. They have simulated with a missile what appears to be a detonation at apogee, that is to say, at the high point of its ballistic trajectory. They need a nuclear weapon, but it is anybody's guess how soon they will have their hands on one. My guess is not too long. Now, one of the questions is, could anybody else be thinking about doing something like this? And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. This is a photograph of the Dear Leader 3.0, Kim Jong-un, surrounded by his general staff back in April of last year. And in the background is this map with this on its title: the Strategic Plan to Strike the U.S. mainland. They actually have, as you know, threatened the United States with nuclear attack repeatedly. They've tested nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. They have collaborated closely, unfortunately, with the Iranians as well. And as Peter alluded to, the Russians actually told the Commission that they had given the the Russians had given the North Koreans a super EMP weapon. Now, you may have heard that the testing that the North Koreans have done, they've done 3 to date, there's another one perhaps in the offing, fizzled because the yield was not seen to be very large. Well, unfortunately, that might be perfectly consistent with testing a super EMP design, where you are not interested in yield, you're interested in gamma rays, which is what generates the effects that Peter was talking about. So, here's another problem. The North Koreans actually had one of those tramp steamers in the Caribbean last summer, and under 10,000 tons of sugar, they had 2 of these on their launchers. These are nuclear capable, relatively primitive, but recently upgraded surface-to-air missiles. Those of you of a certain age may remember they were used to shoot down Gary Powers during the early days of the Cold War when he was flying a U-2 over the Soviet Union. They would get a nuclear weapon, if they had one aboard it, up to roughly 90 miles. And you remember that footprint would give you a lot of coverage of the United States. This is kind of a problem, but so is this. As Peter Pry has reported with Jim Woolsey, the former director of Central Intelligence, at about the same time that those photographs were taken about the strategic plan to strike the U.S. mainland, coming up from the south on the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and so on of April, was a satellite, that the North Koreans had launched that was at about 300 miles, which means you get very substantial coverage of the United States, and orbiting a satellite that could conceivably have held that super EMP weapon. So that's kind of a problem, because in fact it is a whole nother means of delivering such a deadly attack on the United States. And as with a missile coming up from the south, a satellite coming up from the south, we have neither early warning systems or any missile defenses arrayed to defend against them, such as we have are all pointing up and out from the east and west of the United States. So, are they the only guys, the Iranians and the North Koreans, thinking about this sort of thing? Alas, no. As Peter, among others, have pointed out, both the Russians and the Chinese have in their doctrine for strategic warfare against the United States, specifically in their cyber warfare doctrine, the use of electromagnetic pulse attacks. Now, just to go back to sort of the idea of this footprint, what's underneath that footprint? Peter showed you a little bit of this a moment ago, so I'll do this quickly. About 75% of the power generating capacity of the United States. Again, under the satellite orbit, that's a fair amount of the footprint. And about 83% of those high voltage or extremely high voltage transformers that, as Peter correctly said, are really the backbone, not just of the grid, but of our civilization. Also, with the overlay, you would see a lot of coverage. These are images of those high voltage transformers, in case you're not familiar with them. This gives you a sense of what's involved in moving one of them around. It is a non-trivial thing, especially since we don't really manufacture them in this country. They have to be brought in by sea. We have 2 railroad cars in the entire U.S. inventory capable of moving them close to the places where things like this have to pick them up and bring them to their destination. Other things that you need to know about this, and some of you are, of course, in the power business, so I'm sure you, regulating it, are familiar with this, but for us laymen, why this is such a problem is you basically need about a year and a half to make one of these things. In a foreign venue, many of them in Germany or in South Korea, you basically have about a year's wait to get to the point where they're manufacturing it to your specifications, because these aren't things that you just have, you know, a standard issue. It has to be specifically designed to go into the place in the grid where you need it. And as Peter indicated, they are vulnerable. And if damaged, even one is a problem. More than one is a very serious concern. Let me just quickly give you some images of the things that Peter talked about that move you away from that high altitude EMP, which I think we worry about most because it's the most efficient way to do this. Conceivably, a country like Iran with a single nuclear weapon that doesn't have to be precisely targeted, that can be brought close to our shores in virtual complete secrecy, could do this very efficiently. But there are some other options, and I'm going to go through these things as Peter introduced you to them very quickly. Starting with this, the Radio Shack version of the local EMP weapon, radio frequency weapon. Peter's team demonstrated that people without a great deal of sophistication and with access only to the kinds of things that you could buy at Radio Shack could build and operate one of these weapons. Several of you are involved in the cyber threat. This is an image that was used to promote a film called American Blackout. If you haven't seen it, I commend it to you. It's not so much about the cyber attack itself as what happened in its aftermath. The interesting technique that they used to make this, I think, real to many of us is much of it seemed to be, or simulated being shot through people's cell phones. which was a very apt way to help people understand that this happens to regular folks and what it means when, as Peter said, there's no food, there's no water, there's no electricity to get you out of the elevator you're stuck in. You can't live in your apartment in a high-rise because as a practical matter, there's no heat, there's no air conditioning, there's no means of getting up and down it, etc. At the risk of spoiling the film for you, I will tell you that at the end of 10 days, inexplicably, the power came back on after this nationwide cyber attack, which allowed for a happy ending, but it also probably conveyed the idea that there is one. And I don't think that's very likely. Just down here at the bottom is something that the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington noted in February. Cyber attacks on key energy infrastructure and on the electricity system are increasing, both in frequency and in sophistication. Some of you in this field may know that there was an incident, I believe about 2 months ago, and I understand it was in Connecticut, which involved a very close call for its grid under a cyber attack. And then there's this, Peter mentioned it, the Metcalf substation outside of San Jose, California. In April of last year, in the dark of night, some unknown number of people went into 2 manhole covers, one here and one about a mile up the road. They cut the 9/11 alarm system in one and a major telecommunications trunk line in another. They came out of those underground vaults to pre-sighted firing positions and put 120 rounds of automatic weapons fire into 17 cooling radiators of 17 of the 21 transformers, high voltage transformers on the site. But for the grace of God, and the fact that one link was not cut, allowing people at an off-site control center to see the pressure dropping as the fuel, the mineral oil came out of those radiators and the temperature started rising on the transformers, we would have lost those 17 and probably the other 4 on the site as well. And I think there were other medium voltage transformers elsewhere on the site that would have been damaged too. The point being that under those circumstances, you probably would have lost power in San Jose, in Silicon Valley, and much of the San Francisco Bay Area for a protracted period of time, with obviously very, very debilitating effects, not only on the people immediately involved, but the society and economy more broadly. So who were those masked men? Well, we don't have a clue. They got away. I'm operating on the assumption that they're still out there. And knowing what they know, that they are a threat to other electric substations as well. Now, interestingly, and some of you in the regulatory business particularly are probably aware of this, this particular episode, though as Peter said, it was hushed up at the time, it nonetheless prompted the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to do some analysis of how many substations like this it would take, were they to be successfully attacked, to crater the grid. And it is a rather sensitive matter, but it was nonetheless published in the Wall Street Journal. The answer was 9. Now, not just any 9, but the right 9. And actually, it's probably a couple of subsets of 9. But out of 2,100 of these things, that's not a big problem. For the attackers, it's a big problem for us. As Peter's indicated, and I won't belabor this point except to simply say, if none of those kinds of man-caused threats to the grid eventuate, this is coming. In fact, in the space of the past 2 days, as you're probably aware, there have been major, not Carrington class, but major solar storms. In fact, I was just reading a moment ago that the one that just happened is causing people to think that radio there may be blackouts for an hour or so when this thing hits the earth. This is going to be bad news for Greg Garrison. I hope it's while he's not on the air. Peter showed you the size of this and so on. I won't, again, belabor the point with this one, that it was bad for the infrastructure at the time. Even lesser storms had this effect, as Peter has showed you, if things are not protected against it. What did the National Academy of Sciences say on the subject? And I don't know how anybody could have come up with these numbers, but for what they're worth, here they are. $1 to $2 trillion, 4 to 10 years to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I say I don't know how you could come up with those numbers, because I don't, frankly, see how you can unscramble the eggs if a major solar storm like 1859 happens. The Lloyds of London, folks who know something about risk, did an analysis, and as Peter's pointed out, what they were actually modeling was not the Carrington-class event. It was something about a fourth as powerful as the railroad storm, if I'm not mistaken. But they came up with this number. 20 million Americans could be without power for up to 2 years. 20 to 40 million Americans. Now, that's a catastrophe, folks, I think by anybody's estimation. Peter showed you this slide. I just re-emphasized the point. This goes away and it cascades through everything else. That's why this is such a threat to civilization as we know it. As Peter has indicated with the booklet that he's handed out, this brief prompts a lot of people to say, this can't be true. This can't be true. Otherwise, something would have been done about it, and he showed you the booklet we put together of the 11 different studies. This is just the executive summaries of those studies, but it'll give you a flavor of it. And the point really is, the government knows that this is a problem, and so, unfortunately, to our enemies, I'm fond of saying, the only people who are in the dark about this are us. And the question is, are we going to be kept in the dark permanently because we don't actually do something about known threats? So, Peter's mentioned this point, 9 out of 10 Americans. I've had people quibble about that. And I honestly don't know whether that's right. I tend to agree with the logic that Peter laid out, Bill Graham's, that we don't have many people who know how to survive in a world without electricity, let alone have access to food and water and places where you can grow things and all that. But, you know, I'm prepared to say it's only half that. That is still a catastrophe of the first order. It is still, in all likelihood, a world without America. And by the way, one of the points that was made, if you happen to be, you know, in that 10% that make it, you're probably not going to like the company you're keeping. Because it's going to be the most ruthless people, by and large, who are going to be able to survive by taking other people's stuff in this kind of event. It is a societal breakdown kind of scenario. And, you know, there are those of us who are serious about preparedness, and I'm generally in favor of that. I'm just not persuaded that there is any way that you can adequately prepare for the consequences of this thing. Certainly on a national basis. Therefore, you have to prepare in the only effective way, which is by doing something about it before one or the other of these things eventuates. So, I just throw this into the mix. My old boss had a wonderful turn of phrase about this. He talked about existential threats to freedom every generation. Well, I would suggest to you that that's what this is. And I just want to quickly go through what do we need to be doing about it. Most of you in the room, I think, have had some exposure to all of these points, but let me just touch them quickly. The people in the building I used to work in, as Peter indicated, have known about this problem for 50 years. They have been working it for 50 years. They have been protecting principally the things that they believe were most critical in my old portfolio, the nuclear forces. the capabilities to deter nuclear attack by making sure that those things would survive an EMP kind of environment. What do you think? Techniques. Surge protectors. High powered and so on, but nonetheless, basically what hopefully you've got your computer plugged into. Capacitors for shunting a surge around what it is you're trying to protect, and Faraday cages. Peter's taught me that we all have Faraday cages in our homes. Microwave ovens. It has been pointed out that if you want to protect your small personal electronic devices, as they say on airplanes, stick it in the microwave. Just don't turn the microwave on. Unfortunately, they will be paperweights for you, even if they survive the effects, because they won't have anything to plug into. But Faraday cages is a practical means of protecting. Peter has indicated, based upon the Commission's report, that the costs are modest. You will get disagreements about exactly what they are, but that's something we need to be teasing out. But the main point is the one that the Commission made, and that is, no matter what the costs are, they are trivial compared to the costs of doing nothing and having the country destroyed. So, this question may be a little sensitive, given the nature of this audience, but I think it needs to be said. Why is it we haven't done something about it? Well, I believe that the reason is nobody's in charge of this. Really, there's no single person, no single agency that has the unalloyed, indisputable responsibility for making sure that this problem is fixed. And everybody who's in the mix, and I'll just go through this with you quickly, thinks really somebody else should either be at least paying for it, if not responsible. The Pentagon, and I, as you know, work there, doesn't think it has enough money to do what is its job right now, let alone responsibility for hardening private sector entities' assets, like the utilities' assets. The utilities, not unreasonably, think that this is not their problem because it's a national security threat. So somebody else ought to be paying for it. And I think, frankly, even more importantly, is the concern that many of them have. There's some here to speak to this if you care to. That regulation is a threat to profitability and how they do their business, and they have an arrangement right now that suits them pretty well, which is that not the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but the North American Electric Reliability Corporation is largely responsible for setting standards, and that is, to my layman's way of thinking, more or less a trade association. And curiously enough, if the industry doesn't want certain standards, it turns out they don't generally get promulgated by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation of America. So we have the folks who generally might do something about that in the absence of anybody else saying, wait a minute, this isn't really satisfactory, deferring to the industry and NERC. So, just very quickly, what needs to be done here, and I will go through this exceedingly quickly. You all are familiar with the power generation facilities themselves. Interestingly enough, arguably the most robust of these power generating facilities is the one that the President has made it his purpose to eliminate. And I gather this is kind of a problem for you all particularly. Coal. At least until the war on coal got underway in earnest, there were typically 6 months worth of coal supplies on site, which, assuming that you didn't have those SCADAs or other electronic control devices crap out, would enable these things to continue generating power even in this terrible circumstance. If this is gone, the coal power plants are gone, nothing else, with the possible exception of hydro, is going to give us the capacity to produce power certainly in a black startup environment. Control rooms are another thing that have to be protected. The grid transformers that we talked about, and their SCADAs and so on, need to be protected. And importantly, and this is often overlooked, the industry has quite sensibly thought it need best not rely on the private sector telecommunications system to meet their emergency needs. So they have their own dedicated network. Unless, of course, somebody cuts it as a Metcalf. This needs to be protected as well. Here is an estimate by the Department of Homeland Security for what it would cost to protect against that E1 very problematic nuclear bomb-driven attack to, say, a primary data center. It's estimated it's between $300,000 and $450,000 per. Not a trivial amount of money, to be sure, but I think also a manageable amount. There is an estimate here from ABB that for roughly $250K, you could provide the kind of protection that we were just talking about to those high voltage transformers.
I know we're waiting on questions, but can you go back to the previous
I
slide?
can't go back to the previous slide. This particular system won't let me do it, but I'll try to answer it. I remember.
There were several numbers there, and it went too quick for me to read through them all. There was one number at the top, the 250 to 300,000. Were the other numbers that were there included in that 250 to 300,000?
No, I think those were additive. I think those were additive. I'll pull that one back up. Let me just press on here. We're almost done. I'm hoping, on the basis of both my remarks and Peter, that this is pretty much self-evident. This is a real threat. Whichever of the flavors you want to concern yourself with. And the thing about those studies, as Peter mentioned, is some people looked at the solar piece, some people looked at the EMP piece, some people looked at the physical threat piece, some people looked at the cyber piece. Irrespective of which of those threats you want to worry about, the bottom line is the same. This is a real threat. We could, in fact, see a world without America. And that's setting aside the naturally occurring phenomenon that we are overdue, by some estimates, to have happen. But that we know will. No, take it to the bank. Will happen. The costs of fixing this problem in advance of one of those things happening are not trivial. They may be as modest as Peter says, they may be somewhat higher, I don't know. But they're trivial compared to what we will lose, for sure. And the only time we can do this really is proactively. I'll just finish with this. The closing line in that statement that President Reagan made in 1961, long before he became president, was that if we don't protect freedom in our lifetime, we're going to wind up telling our children and our children's children what it was like to live in the United States when men were free. My codicil to that is we're going to wind up telling them what it was like to live in the United States